I am Richard, 70 years old, and somehow I am still processing the ultimate betrayal my own son orchestrated just weeks after my wife died. As a commercial real estate developer in Denver, I built an empire to secure our future, but I maintained a blind spot for my only child. 3 weeks after my wife passed away, my son and his wife invited themselves over for dinner. Between sips of my expensive Bordeaux, Jason slid a document across the table. "Dad, we are selling your house," he said casually. "You need full-time care now." I simply looked at his $40,000 watch and smiled. That night I knew they were not getting a single dime of my estate, and I began planning my relocation to the hidden Wyoming ranch. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family members who underestimated your intelligence and your worth. Building a life in Denver meant 40 years of ruthless negotiations and pouring my blood into every property I developed. Inside our $3 million estate, none of that corporate warfare mattered. This house was Catherine. She had picked out the custom Italian marble dining table we were sitting at. The dirt on her grave was barely dry. It had been exactly 21 days since we buried her. I was deep in mourning. But the corporate shark in me never truly sleeps. Right now, every instinct I had honed over my career was screaming at me. Jason sat across from me, swirling a glass of my vintage wine. He is 40 years old, currently serving as the vice president at my firm. I gave him that title. But looking at him now, I saw nothing of myself. He wore a tailored suit that cost more than my first car, and on his wrist gleamed a massive $40,000 watch. I knew his salary did not cover that luxury, especially not with the credit card bills I had been quietly paying off to help them out. Next to him sat Victoria, his 36-year-old wife. Dressed in a pristine designer gown, her nails were freshly manicured. She was a socialite heavily reliant on the financial safety net I provided. The air in the dining room was suffocating. Jason cleared his throat. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a glossy brochure, followed by a thick stack of legal papers. He slid them across the cool surface of the marble until they stopped right in front of my plate. I looked down. The brochure featured smiling, gray-haired people walking through a garden. The bold lettering read, "Silver Pines Nursing Home." Beneath it was a general power of attorney, granting Jason full legal and financial control over my entire estate. "Dad, we need to have a serious conversation." Jason began, his tone dripping with practiced empathy. "We are selling the house. You need 24/7 care now, and this place is simply too much for you to manage on your own." I did not touch the papers. I kept my hands folded in my lap, my face completely impassive. I let the silence stretch out, a classic negotiation tactic. I wanted him to fill the void. Jason shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Look, Dad, I know this is hard to hear. Mom just passed and we are all grieving. But we have to be practical. Silver Pines is an exclusive facility. They have round-the-clock medical staff. You will not have to worry about maintaining a property of this size. You deserve to relax." If I signed that paper, Jason would have the legal authority to liquidate my assets, access my bank accounts, and sell the very house I was sitting in. He was not talking about care. He was talking about a hostile takeover. "Well, why would you assume I cannot manage this house?" I asked, my voice calm and devoid of emotional frailty. "I am 70 years old, Jason. I ran a board meeting last Tuesday. I drive my own car. I am grieving my wife, not losing my mind." Victoria placed her manicured hand over Jason's, playing the role of the deeply concerned daughter-in-law. "Richard," she said, using my name with a soft sigh. "We just want what is best for you. You have been so forgetful lately. It is entirely normal after a major shock, but we cannot be here 24 hours a day to watch over you. Jason is busy running the company. We are terrified you might hurt yourself." "Forgetful?" I raised an eyebrow. "Give me an example." "Well," Victoria stammered slightly, "last week you left the gas stove on. It was incredibly dangerous. And yesterday you completely forgot the name of the delivery driver who brings your packages. It breaks our hearts to see you like this." I stared at her, letting the cold reality of her lie wash over me. I had not turned on the gas stove in 3 months. Ever since Catherine got sick, we had been ordering meals. The kitchen had remained untouched. As for the delivery driver, I simply had not bothered to learn the new guy's name. They were trying to gaslight me into believing I was incompetent. "I see," I replied smoothly. "So the solution to a supposed memory lapse is for me to surrender all my assets to you, sell my home, and lock myself in an assisted living facility." Jason leaned forward. "Dad, the maintenance on this estate is astronomical. The property taxes alone are a massive drain on resources that the company could be using for expansion. You are sitting on millions of dollars in dead equity. If we liquidate this property, we can ensure you are comfortable at Silver Pines, and the rest of the capital can be injected into the firm. Your mother has been in the ground for exactly 21 days, I said, the temperature in the room plummeting. And you are already trying to evict me and strip my assets to fund your corporate ambitions." Jason flushed, a mix of anger and embarrassment coloring his cheeks. "This is not about Mom. This is about reality. You cannot hold on to the reins forever. I am the vice president. I need capital to grow the business, and you are hoarding it out of pure sentimentality. You are acting like a stubborn old man who refuses to see that his time is over." The audacity was staggering. This boy who I had elevated to a position of power was sitting in my home drinking my wine and demanding I hand over my life's work. I could feel the hot fury demanding I throw them out. But reacting emotionally only gives your opponent the upper hand. "I am not signing these documents." "Jason," I said firmly, pushing the legal papers back across the table. "I am perfectly capable of making my own medical and financial decisions. This conversation is over." Victoria's polite facade shattered instantly. Her eyes narrowed and her voice lost all its sugary sweetness, becoming sharp and venomous. "You do not really have a choice in this matter, Richard." "Is that a threat, Victoria?" I asked. She smiled with a calculated, predatory grin. "It is a reality check. You might think you are perfectly fine, but trauma does terrible things to the elderly brain. Jason has a very good friend from his country club, Dr. Aris. He is a highly respected private psychiatrist here in Denver. Jason spoke with him yesterday about your recent erratic behavior, the stove incident, the memory loss, the mood swings. Dr. Aris is fully prepared to evaluate you," Victoria continued, her voice dripping with malice. "And based on what we have described, he is very confident he will find that your severe grief has triggered early-onset dementia. If you do not sign the power of attorney voluntarily, Jason will file a motion for an emergency medical conservatorship in court. We will have a judge declare you legally incompetent. You will be forced out of this house, and Jason will take control of the estate anyway." The silence that followed was deafening. I looked at my son, waiting for him to object, waiting for him to tell his wife she had gone too far. But Jason simply looked away, giving his silent consent to her monstrous threat. They were not just trying to steal my money. They were threatening to strip me of my human rights, to lock me away in a facility, and to erase my legal existence. My heart hammered against my ribs, but my face remained a mask of stone. A chilling calmness settled over me. I realized in that exact moment that the son I had raised was gone, replaced by a parasite. But what they did not know was that Catherine had anticipated this greed. She had left me a secret lifeline. They thought they had cornered an old grieving man. They had no idea they had just declared a brutal war on a seasoned shark. Victoria leaned across the Italian marble table, her meticulously manicured hands trembling with practiced perfection. She let out a soft, shuddering breath, and right on cue, a single tear slipped down her powdered cheek. She reached out, trying to place her hand over mine, but I subtly pulled back, letting her fingers rest on the cold stone instead. "Richard, please do not look at us like that," she whispered, her voice cracking with the exact amount of fragility one might expect from an Oscar-winning performance. "We are not doing this to hurt you. We are doing this because we love you so much, and it breaks our hearts to watch you decline. You have to understand how terrified we were last week." She paused, dabbing the corner of her eye with a silk napkin, ensuring her mascara remained flawless. "Do you not remember?" she asked gently, tilting her head with a look of profound sorrow. "Last Thursday, you left the gas stove burning in the kitchen. It was on for hours. If Jason had not stopped by to check on you, the entire house could have gone up in flames. And then yesterday you stood at the front door staring blankly at the delivery driver. You argued with him because you completely forgot his name even though he has been delivering your packages for years. We cannot simply stand by and watch you become a danger to yourself. Catherine would never forgive us if we let something terrible happen to you while you were alone in this massive empty house." Her words hung in the air, thick and cloying, wrapping around the room like a suffocating blanket. To a casual observer, she would have seemed like the epitome of a devoted, grieving daughter-in-law. But my internal radar, finely tuned by 40 years of navigating the treacherous waters of commercial real estate, was screaming at maximum volume. A cold, hard knot formed in the pit of my stomach as I dissected her lies. I looked toward the arched doorway leading into the kitchen. The magnificent 6-burner commercial gas stove sat there pristine and completely untouched. I had not turned a single knob on that appliance in over 3 months. Catherine was the culinary soul of this home. When the illness took hold of her, the kitchen went silent. Since the day we buried her, I had survived exclusively on tasteless takeout and microwave meals. The idea that I had left the gas burning was not just a fabrication. It was a desperate, sloppy fiction. As for the delivery driver, the regular courier, a jovial man named Thomas, had been transferred to a different route a month ago. The man who brought my packages yesterday was a complete stranger, a young kid barely out of his teens. Of course, I did not know his name. They were twisting mundane realities into symptoms of dementia, meticulously laying the groundwork for their emergency medical conservatorship. They needed me to doubt my own mind. They needed me to feel fragile, broken, and dependent. Instead of exposing their pathetic ruse, I decided to play the exact role they had scripted for me. In business, when your opponent underestimates you, you never correct them. You let them dig their grave deeper. I allowed my shoulders to slump slightly, letting out a long, heavy sigh. I lowered my gaze, adopting the posture of an exhausted, confused old man who was slowly losing his grip on reality. "Is that true?" I murmured, my voice wavering just enough to sell the performance. "I do not remember leaving the stove on. I suppose my mind has been a bit foggy lately. It is just so hard without her here." As I spoke, I kept my eyes fixed on Jason. While Victoria maintained her weeping facade, my son was unraveling right in front of me. For a man who recently demanded full operational control of my company, claiming he was ready to handle a multi-million-dollar enterprise, he looked completely unhinged. A fine sheen of sweat coated his forehead, catching the dim light of the dining room chandelier. He kept shifting his weight from side to side, unable to sit still, but the most glaring tell was his phone. It sat face down on the marble table next to the nursing home brochure, vibrating relentlessly. Every few seconds, a harsh mechanical buzz would interrupt the silence. Each time it happened, Jason flinched. He would snatch the device, glance at the screen with wide, panicked eyes, and quickly shove it back into his pocket, only to pull it out again a minute later. He was projecting the desperate, suffocating aura of a man drowning in deep, dangerous waters. This was not the behavior of a successful corporate vice president, pulling in a $300,000 annual salary. This was the frantic, cornered demeanor of a degenerate gambler who owed the wrong people a massive amount of money. The puzzle pieces were clicking into place with terrifying clarity. The $40,000 Rolex on his wrist, the relentless phone calls, the desperate urgency to liquidate my $3 million estate just 3 weeks after his mother's funeral. Jason was not securing my future. He was trying to save his own life. He needed cash, and he needed it immediately. The medical conservatorship was just a legal crowbar to break into my vault. I rubbed my temples, leaning heavily against the table as if the weight of their accusations had finally crushed my spirit. You have given me a lot to process, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I am very tired. The grief is heavy today. Please leave the paperwork on the table. I need to go to my study and rest. Let me think about everything you have said. Jason exhaled a loud, ragged breath of relief. Of course, Dad, he said quickly, standing up and smoothing his expensive suit jacket. Take your time. We will leave the documents here. Just review them when you are ready. We love you. We will let ourselves out. I did not watch them leave. I walked slowly down the hallway, maintaining my frail shuffle until I heard the heavy oak front door click shut. The second the deadbolt engaged, my posture straightened. The act was over. I moved with quiet, deliberate speed into my private study and locked the door behind me. I pulled back the Persian rug and knelt beside my hidden floor safe. I spun the combination dial, the mechanical clicks echoing in the silent room. I pulled the heavy steel door open, reaching for the joint checkbook Catherine and I kept for emergency cash reserves. My hand grasped empty space. The leather-bound checkbook was gone. I frantically pulled out the remaining documents, my heart turning to ice. Lying at the bottom of the safe, precisely where the checkbook should have been, was a crumpled, bizarre bank notice. I unfolded the thick paper, my eyes scanning the harsh black ink. It was a receipt for a massive cash withdrawal. $50,000 had been drained from the joint account. I certainly had never authorized it. The grief that had anchored me to the floor of my study evaporated, replaced instantly by the cold, calculating precision I had used to dismantle rival developers for 4 decades. The mourning husband who had buried his beloved Catherine 3 weeks ago ceased to exist in that exact moment. In his place stood the ruthless commercial real estate mogul who had clawed his way to the top of the Denver market. I stared at the bank receipt in my trembling hands, my mind racing through the implications. $50,000. It was a significant sum, but for a man in Jason's position, it was an odd number. It was the kind of money someone needed in a panic, not a strategic withdrawal. If I walked out into the living room right now and confronted him, he would deny it. He would spin another web of lies. Victoria would cry her fake tears, and they would immediately accelerate their plans for the medical conservatorship. I needed leverage, and I needed it before they realized I was hunting them. I carefully folded the receipt and placed it back into the floor safe, locking the heavy steel door and pulling the Persian rug over it. I walked to the adjoining bathroom, splashed freezing water on my face, and stared at my reflection. I looked old, yes, but the fire in my eyes was entirely reignited. I smoothed my collar, took a deep breath, and walked back out into the hallway. The house was silent. Jason and Victoria had left, likely congratulating themselves on a successful performance. I grabbed my keys, walked out to the garage, and got into my heavy-duty SUV. I bypassed the upscale downtown districts and headed straight for a gritty, nondescript strip mall on the outskirts of the city. I walked into a cheap electronics store, paying cash for an untraceable prepaid mobile phone. I activated it in the parking lot, sitting behind the tinted windows of my vehicle. The first number I dialed was one I had memorized 15 years ago. Benjamin Carter was not just a corporate attorney. He was an apex predator in a tailored suit. He had navigated my most hostile acquisitions and shielded my wealth from every vulture who had ever tried to circle my empire. He answered on the second ring. Benjamin. It is Richard. I said, my voice steady and low. I am calling from a secure line. I need you to listen very carefully and execute my instructions without asking questions right now. Richard. It is good to hear your voice, Benjamin replied, his tone shifting into business mode. What do you need? I need a total lockdown on my personal estate, I instructed. Freeze every liquid asset, block any transfer requests, and put a hard stop on any power of attorney inquiries that might come across your desk. Then I need you to initiate a ghost audit on my son. Look into every single corporate transaction Jason has authorized in the last 3 weeks. Dig into his personal accounts, his credit lines, and his operational expenditures. I want to know where every penny is moving, and he cannot know he is being watched. Benjamin did not hesitate. The lockdown is active as of this second. I will deploy my forensic team on Jason immediately. Are we expecting a breach? We are already bleeding Benjamin. Just find the source of the wound. Call me back on this exact number the moment you have something concrete. I hung up and tossed the burner phone onto the passenger seat. The financial flank was secured, but I needed eyes inside my own fortress. I drove across town to a specialized security boutique I had used years ago to secure a highly sensitive commercial data center. The young technician behind the counter barely looked up from his tablet when I walked in, assuming I was just another paranoid wealthy retiree looking for a standard burglar alarm. I placed a stack of $100 bills on the glass counter. I need military-grade motion-activated hidden cameras. I told him my tone, leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. They must be completely undetectable, reliant on an independent cellular signal, and they must stream directly to a secure cloud server that only I can access from an external laptop. I want audio capture sensitive enough to pick up a whisper from across a large room. The technician blinked, pocketed the cash, and disappeared into the back room. He returned with 4 matte black devices, each no larger than a standard lapel button. He walked me through the encryption protocols and the installation process. I paid him another $1,000 to forget my face and walked out. When I returned to my estate, the grand empty house felt different. It was no longer a sanctuary of memories. It was a battlefield. I moved with a meticulous, quiet urgency that defied my 70 years. I started in the living room, the space where Jason and Victoria felt most comfortable plotting. I embedded the first micro camera inside the ornate carving of the antique wooden mantel above the fireplace. The angle provided a sweeping view of the entire seating area. I placed the second camera inside the dense foliage of a large potted ficus near the windows, ensuring there were no blind spots. Then I moved to my private study. This was the nerve center of my home, the place where all my sensitive documents and the floor safe resided. I hid the third camera within the binding of a hollowed-out encyclopedia on the highest bookshelf. I positioned the final camera directly under the lip of my heavy oak desk, angling it perfectly to capture anyone who tried to approach the safe. My joints ached from the physical exertion of climbing step stools and contorting my body under furniture, but the adrenaline coursing through my veins masked the pain entirely. I tested the feeds on my encrypted laptop. The high-definition video streamed flawlessly, rendering the rooms in crisp detail. The audio picked up the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. The trap was set. Now all I had to do was wait for the rats to take the bait. I poured myself a single glass of bourbon, sitting in the dim light of the study, staring at the monitor. The silence of the house stretched out heavy and expectant. I thought about the sheer audacity of my son, sitting at my dining table, drinking my wine, while actively plotting to lock me away in a dementia ward. 4 hours passed in a slow, agonizing crawl. The sun began to dip below the Rocky Mountains. The sudden vibration of the burner phone on the oak desk shattered the silence. I snatched it up, immediately pressing it to my ear. Richard Benjamin said, his voice stripped of its usual calm. Jason did not just withdraw $50,000. He tried to leverage the entire company operational fund to cover a massive margin call on crypto investments this morning. The bank blocked it, but he is completely out of control right now, and we must act extremely fast. Benjamin, maintain this freeze on my... commanded, my voice cold and unwavering despite the adrenaline surging through my veins. Do not let a single cent move from those accounts. I am leaving the house right now. I will contact you when I am secure. I ended the call and tossed the burner phone into my overnight bag. The time for passive observation was over. I needed to give Jason and Victoria the empty arena they so desperately craved, but I was not about to leave them unsupervised. I pulled out my primary smartphone and dialed Jason. I waited for 3 rings before he answered, his voice breathless and tight, likely still reeling from his failed attempt to raid the corporate funds. "Dad," he answered, trying to force a tone of casual concern. "Is everything all right?" I let out a long, ragged sigh, leaning heavily against the kitchen counter to ground my performance. "Jason," I began, letting my voice crack just a fraction. "You and Victoria were right. I am struggling. The memories in this house are suffocating me. I spoke with a coordinator at a private grief counseling retreat up in the mountains. They had a last-minute cancellation, and I decided to take the spot for the weekend. I need some time away to clear my head and think about the future. The relief on the other end of the line was palpable. I could practically hear the tension leaving his shoulders. "Dad." "That is a fantastic idea," Jason said, his voice instantly smoothing out into a practiced, soothing rhythm. "You need to focus on your mental health right now. Take all the time you need. Victoria and I will keep an eye on the house. Do not worry about a thing here." I hung up the phone and grabbed my bag. I walked out the front door, locking the deadbolt behind me, and drove my heavy-duty SUV down the winding driveway. I did not head toward the mountains. Instead, I drove straight into the heart of downtown Denver and checked into a high-security anonymous luxury suite under a corporate account name that Jason did not know existed. The suite was pristine, silent, and cold. I locked the heavy door, closed the blackout curtains, and set my encrypted laptop on the glass dining table. I booted up the system and logged into the secure cloud server. The 4 camera feeds blinked to life on my screen. The living room, the hallway, and the 2 angles in my study were perfectly framed in high-definition video. I poured a glass of sparkling water, sat back in the leather chair, and waited. I did not have to wait long. Exactly 2 hours after my vehicle had left the estate, the front door feed showed movement. Victoria walked into the foyer. She was not alone. The man following her inside was not Jason, and he certainly was not a standard real estate agent. He wore a sharp, dark suit with no tie, and his demeanor was aggressive, calculating, and entirely transactional. He carried a laser measuring tool and a thick leather portfolio. He did not bother to take off his shoes, tracking dirt onto the expensive Persian rugs Catherine had imported from Turkey. "We have a very tight window," Victoria said, pacing the length of the living room, while the man rapidly scanned the dimensions of the space. Her voice was sharp, stripped of the sweet, caring daughter-in-law persona she had weaponized at the dining table just yesterday. "Jason says the buyers are ready to move forward, but we need this closed by Friday." The man did not even look at the antique furniture or the fine art on the walls. He was looking at the structural bones of the house, calculating pure, ruthless value. "A 4-day turnaround is complicated." "Mrs. Harrison," the man replied in a flat, gravelly voice. "My investment group specializes in off-market cash liquidations. We do not do inspections, we do not do contingencies, and we do not wait for traditional bank approvals. But that speed comes at a premium discount. We will offer 60 cents on the dollar for the current market value." I watched the screen, my jaw clenching. An off-market cash liquidation. They were not trying to sell my house to a nice family looking to move into the neighborhood. They were trying to dump my $3 million estate to a shadow investment group for a fraction of its worth, just to get a massive influx of untraceable cash in 4 days. It was a fire sale of my entire life. Stone. "We will take the discount," Victoria snapped, crossing her arms tightly. "We just need the wire transfer cleared into our holding account before the weekend. The syndicate is breathing down Jason's neck. If they do not get their $2.5 million by Friday, we are completely out of options. We need this cash right now." The man grunted in acknowledgement and walked down the hallway, stepping directly into the frame of my study camera. He walked over to my heavy oak desk and sat down in my leather chair, completely invading my private space. The camera mounted under the lip of the desk captured his face and his hands perfectly. He opened his portfolio and pulled out a tablet, tapping the screen rapidly as he pulled up what looked like a preliminary title report. Victoria followed him into the study, her heels clicking anxiously against the hardwood floor. "Well," she demanded, "are the buyers going to authorize the transfer or not? We have the medical conservatorship papers drafted. Once the old man signs them or the judge forces it tomorrow, Jason has full legal authority to execute the sale." The appraiser stared at his tablet, his eyes narrowing. He scrolled down the screen, his aggressive posture suddenly shifting into rigid annoyance. He looked up at Victoria, his face hardening into a scowl. "You people are wasting my time." "What are you talking about?" Victoria asked, her voice trembling slightly. The man tossed the tablet onto my desk. "You did not tell me there was a secondary mortgage on this property," he growled. "My buyers deal in clean, unencumbered titles. We cannot execute a quiet off-market cash liquidation without clearing the HELOC first. This title is dirty." Victoria stepped forward, her face contorting in genuine confusion. "A HELOC, a home equity line of credit. That is impossible. Richard paid this house off in full 15 years ago. He brags about it all the time. There is no mortgage. There is no debt on this property." The man tapped the screen of the tablet aggressively. "The county recorder says otherwise, lady. There is an active home equity line of credit filed against this property authorized exactly 4 months ago. The balance drawn is $1.2 million. Until that lien is satisfied, my group is not touching this house." Sitting in my hotel room miles away, my blood ran completely cold. I froze my eyes locked on the monitor, my mind struggling to process the impossible words echoing from the laptop speakers. A secondary mortgage. $1.2 million. 4 months ago. I had never authorized a single home equity loan in my life. I hated debt. I had paid pure cash for every single renovation and cleared the original mortgage exactly a decade and a half ago. My property title was pristine. But the official county records were showing a massive active lien. Someone had bypassed the bank security. Someone had forged a multi-million-dollar loan against my home, and I suddenly realized that the betrayal I was dealing with was far more sinister than I had ever possibly imagined. I stared at the black screen of my laptop, the crushing weight of the revelation pressing down on my chest. $1.2 million stolen directly from the equity of my own home. Jason and Victoria had not just planned a hostile takeover of my estate. They had already pillaged it. My mind raced, calculating how they could have possibly bypassed the strict security protocols at my primary financial institution. To authorize a loan of that magnitude against a jointly owned property, they would have needed my signature, and they would have needed Catherine's. The thought of my late wife brought a sudden sharp memory rushing back to the forefront of my mind. It was a memory from her final days in the intensive care unit, a moment I had previously attributed to the delirium of her heavy medication. She had pulled my head down close to her resting face, her grip surprisingly strong, and whispered instructions about a private safety deposit box at the downtown First National Bank branch. She had given me a sequence of numbers and told me to go there only if Jason ever tried to take control of the company. I had brushed it off as a fever dream at the time. Now it sounded like a prophetic warning. I grabbed my dark wool coat and left the hotel room moving with a desperate, focused energy that I had not felt in years. The long drive down to the bustling financial district was a chaotic blur of gray concrete, aggressive morning commuters and flashing traffic lights. I pulled directly into the secured underground parking garage of the First National Bank, my hands gripping the steering wheel so incredibly tightly that my knuckles turned completely white under the strain. I walked into the grand lobby, bypassing the standard teller lines, and approached the vault manager. I immediately presented my official identification and recited the specific box number Catherine had murmured to me. The manager, a stoic woman with graying hair, verified my credentials in silence. She led me down a long, sterile corridor lined with heavy steel doors and into the private viewing room. She handed me a long brass key, unlocked her side of the dual mechanism on the wall, and quickly left me completely alone to my thoughts inside the small, cold, windowless room. I gently placed the long metal box onto the felt-lined viewing table. My hands, which had remained perfectly steady during 4 decades of ruthless corporate negotiations, were visibly shaking. I took a deep breath, inserted the brass key, and lifted the heavy lid. Inside the box was packed to the brim. Neatly stacked rows of banded $100 bills filled the majority of the space. I did not need to count them to know it was a massive sum. The bank bands indicated $10,000 per stack. There were at least 40 stacks in total. $400,000 in pure, untraceable cash. It was a financial ghost deliberately withdrawn and hidden away over a long period of time to avoid triggering any corporate audit alerts. But the cash was not the most shocking item in the box. Lying on top of the currency was a thick manila envelope containing legal documents. I opened it and pulled out a pristine property deed. It was not for a commercial building in Denver or a vacation home in Florida. It was a deed for a sprawling, fully paid-off ranch located deep in the remote mountains of Wyoming. The property was registered under an obscure anonymous trust, but the beneficiary listed was exclusively me. Beneath the deed lay a handwritten letter on Catherine's personalized stationery. I recognized the elegant looping strokes of her handwriting immediately. My eyes traced the words, and with every sentence the image of the son I thought I knew completely shattered. Richard. The letter began, "If you are reading this, it means my worst fears have come to pass, and I am no longer there to shield you. I have known for months that Jason is entirely compromised. I found out shortly before I got sick. He has been systematically stealing from your firm, covering massive personal debts born out of reckless arrogance. He is drowning, Richard, and he will pull you under the water to save himself. I could not tell you the truth while I was fighting my illness. I knew your temper. I knew you would confront him and he would use your anger against you. Instead, I built you a sanctuary. I slowly liquidated my personal trust funds and bought the Wyoming property. Take this cash. Take the ranch deed. Relocate immediately and burn his bridges before he has the chance to burn yours. Do not trust him. Do not hesitate. Survive." A profound, suffocating silence settled over the small viewing room. A single tear escaped my eye, landing silently on the smooth surface of the letter. Catherine had spent her final agonizing months of life not focused on her own pain, but on meticulously orchestrating a survival plan for me. She had seen the monster our son had become long before my blind paternal loyalty allowed me to notice. She had given me a $400,000 war chest and a hidden fortress out of pure love. I carefully folded the letter and placed it into my breast pocket, right next to my racing heart. I transferred the stacks of cash into my leather briefcase along with the Wyoming property deed. I felt an overwhelming surge of gratitude toward my late wife, inextricably mixed with a burning absolute hatred for my son. I was no longer a grieving widower. I was a general preparing for total corporate and personal warfare. I would honor her last wishes perfectly. I closed the empty metal box and signaled for the vault manager. As I stepped out of the heavy steel doors and walked back into the bright, bustling lobby of the bank, my primary smartphone buzzed violently in my pocket. I pulled it out, assuming it was Benjamin calling with an update on the ghost audit. It was not Benjamin. It was an automated high-priority alert from my premium credit and legal monitoring service. The notification flashed across the screen in bold, undeniable text. I stopped walking. My feet rooted to the polished marble floor of the bank lobby as I read the alert. Someone had just officially filed a motion for emergency medical conservatorship over Richard Harrison in the Denver County Court. The petitioner was listed as Jason Harrison. The filing included a sworn medical affidavit claiming I was an immediate danger to myself and completely incapable of managing my estate. The legal machinery to strip me of my human rights, my freedom, and my wealth had just been officially activated by my own flesh and blood. Jason was not waiting for me to return from my fake retreat. He had launched his nuclear strike while I was out of the house, attempting to blindside me before I could secure any legal protection. The war had officially begun, and there would finally be absolutely no mercy left to give. The heavy briefcase anchored to my side held $400,000 and the Wyoming deed. I did not panic when I read the notification about the emergency medical conservatorship. Panic is a luxury for the unprepared, and thanks to Catherine, I was fully equipped for war. I stepped into the privacy of my vehicle, locked the doors, and retrieved the burner phone from my overnight bag. I dialed Benjamin immediately. He answered before the first ring finished. I told him about the conservatorship, filing my voice steady and cold. I told him to deploy his aggressive legal countermeasures and to stall the court. But more importantly, I told him I needed the ghost audit accelerated. I needed the best forensic accounting team money could buy, and I needed them operating entirely off the grid right now. Benjamin gave me an address for a private cybersecurity firm located in an unmarked building just outside the city limits. He assured me they were the absolute best in the business. They were a black ops financial unit that specialized in dismantling corporate espionage and unraveling complex embezzlement schemes. They did not ask questions, and they did not leave digital footprints. I drove there without hesitation. The facility looked like an abandoned warehouse from the outside, but inside it was a fortress of humming servers and glowing monitors. The lead auditor was a sharp, calculating man named Marcus. I immediately resolved to call him by his last name, Vance, to avoid the sour taste of that name on my tongue. I set my leather briefcase on his metal desk and popped the brass locks. I laid out $100,000 in banded cash. I told Vance I needed to completely bypass the corporate firewalls of my own real estate development firm. I needed to see exactly what the vice president was hiding, and I needed it done by sunset. Vance did not bat an eye at the mountain of cash. He swept the currency into a drawer, gestured for me to sit in the corner of the dark room, and immediately mobilized his team of 5 elite analysts. They worked in absolute silence. Their fingers flew across illuminated keyboards with terrifying speed. I watched them dismantle the security protocols I had paid hundreds of thousands of dollars to install over the years. It took them barely 3 hours to breach the primary servers and bypass the secondary encryption layers Jason had secretly established. They did not just break into the company network. They gutted it. They pulled down shadow ledgers, hidden offshore routing numbers, and encrypted communication logs. I sat in the shadows, drinking black coffee, feeling a strange mixture of violation and grim satisfaction. My son thought he was a mastermind. He thought he was a brilliant tactician who could outsmart the man who built the empire. He was about to learn that real power does not live in stolen titles or luxury watches. As the hours ticked by, I thought about Victoria and Jason sitting in my home. They were likely celebrating their clever legal maneuver with my expensive wine. They truly believed they had won. They thought the conservatorship filing was a masterstroke. They thought it would render me helpless and mute. They thought it would legally trap me in a dementia ward while they sold my life to the highest bidder. They were so blinded by their own greed and arrogance that they failed to realize they had triggered a catastrophic chain of events. Catherine had known. She had seen the rot festering inside our son. She had seen the weak, entitled desperation that I had mistaken for ambition. I had spent decades teaching Jason how to negotiate. I taught him how to read a room. I taught him how to close a deal. But I had never taught him how to survive the consequences of a monumental betrayal. The forensic accountants continued their silent, relentless digital excavation. They pulled the ugly truth out from the depths of the servers. Vance stood up from his terminal. His face was entirely devoid of emotion. He walked over to a printer in the corner. He retrieved a thick stack of freshly printed documents. He placed them into a black folder and approached where I was sitting. The financial reality is far worse than simple incompetence or standard corporate embezzlement, he began. His voice was low and clinical. Your son is not just bad at business, Mr. Harrison. He is completely compromised. Vance opened the folder and laid out a series of complex transaction maps. Jason has been actively engaged in catastrophic, highly leveraged cryptocurrency gambling for the past 14 months. He chased a series of volatile market trends. He utilized unauthorized company funds as collateral to cover his initial losses. When the market crashed, his positions were liquidated. He was left holding a massive, unpayable deficit. I stared at the staggering numbers highlighted in bright red ink across the pages. The scale of his financial ruin was breathtaking. But where did Victoria fit into this nightmare, I asked. My voice betrayed none of the absolute fury boiling inside my chest. Vance pulled out a separate stack of credit card statements and social media analysis reports. Victoria has been aiding him by meticulously maintaining their ultra-wealthy facade, Vance explained. She utilized multiple hidden corporate credit cards to fund their extravagant lifestyle. Designer wardrobes, first-class vacations, and luxury vehicle leases. She was effectively bleeding the operational budget dry. She did this to project an image of immense success to her online followers. She did this all while knowing her husband was drowning in a multi-million-dollar financial abyss. They were cannibalizing your entire empire simply to buy themselves a few more months of fake prestige. But the superficial spending was just a minor symptom of a much darker disease. Vance flipped to the final section of the report. His expression grew exceptionally grim. The cryptocurrency losses were just the beginning, he stated. Jason attempted to recover his position by borrowing money from a shadow lending syndicate based offshore. These are not standard corporate lenders, Mr. Harrison. They operate completely outside the bounds of traditional law. They are a modernized, sophisticated, organized crime syndicate. Your son owes them exactly $2.5 million. That explains the off-market cash liquidation they were desperately trying to execute today with your home. They needed fast, untraceable liquidity to satisfy this debt before the end of the week. Vance did not speak immediately. He looked at me with a solemn, heavy gaze. He reached into the black folder and pulled out one final, isolated document. It was a scanned copy of an incredibly dense legal contract. He slid the piece of paper across the metal desk until it rested directly under the harsh glow of the lamp. The lead auditor tapped his index finger against the bottom right corner of the page. Mr. Harrison, your son did not just embezzle Vance, said his voice dropping to a grave whisper. He used your forged digital signature to act as a guarantor for his mob debts. If he defaults, they take your company. The silence in the Black Ops accounting firm was absolute. I stared at the forged signature on the digital document, my mind attempting to process the sheer magnitude of my son's betrayal. Jason had not merely gambled away millions in a volatile market. He had weaponized my name, my reputation, and my life's work as collateral for a criminal syndicate. If he missed his payment, dangerous men would not just break his legs. They would legally seize the commercial real estate empire I had spent 40 years building. I thanked Vance for his meticulous work, gathered my briefcase, and walked out into the frigid night air. I drove back to my downtown hotel suite in a state of hyper-focused clarity. The initial shock had entirely burned away, leaving behind a cold, mechanical resolve. I was no longer dealing with an entitled child. I was dealing with a cornered animal willing to feed me to the wolves to save his own skin. I unlocked the heavy door to my hotel suite and stepped into the dark, silent room. I did not bother to turn on the overhead lights. The only illumination came from the glowing screen of my encrypted laptop on the glass dining table. I checked my watch. It was exactly 2 a.m. The city outside my window was quiet, but the digital feeds on my monitor painted a very different picture. I sat down in the leather chair and maximized the video feed from my private study. Jason and Victoria were occupying the room. They had shed their carefully curated daytime facades. Jason had discarded his expensive suit jacket. His tie hung loosely, and his hair was an unkempt mess. He was pacing the length of my study like a caged predator. Victoria was slouched in my heavy oak chair, a half-empty bottle of premium scotch on the desk. She was drinking heavily, her makeup smeared completely devoid of the polite daughter-in-law persona she had weaponized yesterday. The audio feed picked up the sharp, frantic sounds of their breathing and the clinking of ice against crystal. I increased the volume on my laptop. They were arguing violently, their voices kept low in a paranoid hiss, but the microphones captured every venomous syllable perfectly. Victoria slammed her glass down on the desk, the sharp crack echoing through the feed. "The cash buyers want the house this week, Jason," she hissed, her voice vibrating with barely contained panic. The appraiser was very clear. They are willing to close the deal and wire the money in 4 days, but only if the title is clean. If that secondary mortgage is not cleared, they walk away. And if they walk away, we have absolutely nothing left to give the syndicate. Jason stopped pacing and dragged his hands down his face in frustration. "I know that, Victoria. You do not need to remind me of the timeline. I am managing the situation." "You are not managing anything," she snapped back, rising from the chair and pointing a manicured finger at his chest. You lied to me. You told me the crypto margins were a sure thing. You told me the operational funds would cover the dip. Now we owe $2.5 million to people who do not send collection letters. They send enforcers. If the syndicate does not get their $2.5 million by Friday, they are coming after us. Do you understand that? They know where we live. They know our routines. We are out of time. I watched the screen, my hands resting flat on the glass table. The sheer desperation in her voice confirmed everything Vance had uncovered. They had leveraged their entire existence on a gamble, and the house always wins. Now the bill was due and they were trying to pay it with my life. Then force the judge to sign the conservatorship tomorrow. Victoria demanded, stepping closer to him. Call Dr. Aris first thing in the morning. Tell him your father wandered out of the house or became violent. Tell him whatever he needs to hear to expedite the medical evaluation. Once the judge grants you the emergency conservatorship, you have full legal authority to authorize the sale of this house. We can clear the home equity line of credit, take the remaining cash from the shadow buyers, and wire it to the syndicate before Friday. It is our only way out of this nightmare. Jason grabbed the bottle of scotch and poured himself a heavy measure. His hands were shaking so violently that the amber liquid spilled onto the polished wood of my desk. He threw the drink back in a single swallow, coughing as the alcohol burned his throat. I am pushing the lawyer as fast as I can, he muttered, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. The courts are slow. The judge wants to review the medical affidavit carefully because my father has no prior history of cognitive decline. Then make a history. Victoria screamed, no longer caring about keeping her voice down. Fake a hospital visit. Claim he had an episode. I do not care what you have to do, Jason. Just get it done. We are talking about our lives. Jason slammed his empty glass onto the desk, his face contorting with a sudden vicious rage. Do you think I do not know that he fired back, his voice dripping with venom? Do you think I want to be in this position? I need the old man out of the way just as much as you do. He is a stubborn, arrogant roadblock, and the second I have that conservatorship in my hand, I am locking him in Silver Pines and throwing away the key. I stared at the monitor, my heart turning to absolute stone. Hearing my own son explicitly state his intention to lock me away and discard me was a profound, suffocating kind of pain. It was the final nail in the coffin of my fatherly love. But his next words sent a completely different kind of shockwave through my system. And the Denver house is just the beginning. Jason continued, leaning heavily over the desk, his eyes wide and manic. Once I have the legal authority over his estate, I can finally access his secure files. I will find out where my mother hid the deed to the Wyoming property, and we will liquidate that too. We can sell the ranch, pay off the rest of the debts, and finally get completely clear of this mess. My blood ran entirely cold. The air in my hotel room suddenly felt non-existent. I stopped breathing, my eyes locked on the glowing screen. Wyoming property. How could they possibly know about the ranch in Wyoming? Catherine had explicitly told me in her final letter that she had purchased the estate through an anonymous trust. She had built that sanctuary in absolute perfect secrecy. There was absolutely no digital footprint, no paper trail linking my name to that land. There was only one place Jason could have possibly acquired that information. The final tragic days in the intensive care unit, the revelation from the hidden camera feed, hung in the silent air of my hotel room. Wyoming. Jason and Victoria knew about the ranch. Catherine assured me in her final letter the property was purchased through an anonymous trust. There was no paper trail in our Denver home, no stray documents in the safe, no emails on the servers. The secret was airtight. Yet my son had just drunkenly declared his intention to liquidate it. There was only one vulnerable window of time where that information could have been intercepted. The 3 weeks Catherine spent in the intensive care unit before she died. Catherine was heavily medicated, drifting in and out of consciousness. I rarely left her side, but sheer exhaustion occasionally forced me to step out. To ensure she was never alone, I hired a private night nurse named Sarah to sit by her bed. As I sat in the glow of my laptop screen, a cold realization settled over me. Sarah was the leak. She was the only other person in that room with unsupervised access to Catherine's personal belongings. I accessed the payroll records from my personal estate accounts and pulled Sarah's home address. She lived in a modest apartment complex on the industrial outskirts of Denver. I grabbed my wool coat, transferred a stack of $100 bills from my briefcase into my pocket, and walked out into the freezing night. My hands gripped the steering wheel with quiet determination. I was no longer a grieving widower. I was a man hunting for the truth. I arrived at the apartment building just after 3 in the morning. I found her unit on the second floor and knocked firmly on the wooden door. I did not pound or shout. A minute passed. I knocked again. Finally, the deadbolt clicked and the door opened a fraction of an inch, secured by a heavy chain. Sarah peered through the narrow gap, her eyes wide with sudden fear as she recognized my face. "Mr. Harrison," she whispered. "What are you doing here?" "Open the door, Sarah," I said, my tone completely devoid of warmth. "We need to have a conversation about my late wife." She hesitated, her eyes darting down the hallway. "Please, you cannot be here. I could lose my license." "You are going to lose much more than your license if you do not unchain this door right now," I replied. "I know what happened in the intensive care unit. You can speak to me, or you can speak to my corporate attorneys and the police. The choice is yours, but you only have 5 seconds to make it." Her shoulders slumped. She unlatched the heavy chain and slowly opened the door wide enough for me to enter. The apartment was small and smelled faintly of cheap coffee. I walked into the living room and stood by the worn sofa, refusing to sit. Sarah stood near the kitchen counter, wrapping her thin robe tightly around herself, her hands shaking. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a thick stack of $100 bills. I tossed it onto the coffee table. "There is $10,000 in that stack," I said. "It is yours to keep with absolutely no repercussions, but only if you tell me exactly what my son and his wife did while you were guarding my dying wife. If you lie to me, I will take that money back, and I will ensure that you are prosecuted as an accessory to elder abuse and financial fraud." Sarah stared at the cash. The sudden sight of the money combined with the crushing weight of her deep guilt broke her completely. Tears spilled over her eyelashes as she collapsed onto a wooden dining chair. "I am so sorry, Mr. Harrison," she sobbed, burying her face in her hands. "I did not want to let them do it. But your son was so aggressive. He told me he had the legal right to manage her affairs." "Tell me exactly what they did," I demanded. "It was during your second week at the hospital," Sarah began, her voice choking. "You had gone home to rest. Catherine was heavily sedated. Jason and Victoria came into the room. They did not even look at her monitors. They went straight for the small closet where we kept her belongings. Victoria grabbed Catherine's leather handbag and started dumping everything out onto the chair. They were frantically searching for something. "What did they find?" I asked, my fists clenching at my sides. "They found a sealed envelope tucked inside the lining of her purse," Sarah confessed. Jason tore it open. It was a property tax document. I heard Victoria gasp. She whispered something about a massive ranch in Wyoming. Jason photographed every single page of the document before shoving it back exactly as they found it. They told me that if I ever mentioned it, they would have me blacklisted from every hospital network in the state. I needed this job. I am so sorry. I stood silently in the center of the small room, sheer disgust radiating through my entire body. They had treated my wife's hospital room like a crime scene, rummaging through her private possessions while she lay defenseless and dying just feet away. They had stolen her final secret. I stared at the weeping nurse. I had the answer I came for. I knew exactly how they discovered the sanctuary. I turned around, preparing to leave the money on the table and walk out. But as my hand reached for the doorknob, Sarah let out a loud, agonizing wail. The sound was so full of raw horror that it stopped me dead in my tracks. "That is not all of it," she cried out, dropping to her knees on the faded carpet. "Please, you have to know the rest. The guilt is literally eating me alive. I simply cannot close my eyes without seeing it." I slowly turned back around, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. "What else happened, Sarah?" I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "What else did my son do to my wife?" She looked up at me, her eyes wide with a haunting terror. "They did not just look through her purse," she gasped. "3 days later, your son came back to the intensive care unit. He brought a strange man in a dark suit carrying a heavy leather briefcase. Catherine was in a coma. She was completely unresponsive, hooked up to the ventilator." Sarah paused, her entire body shaking, as she forced herself to finish the confession. "Your son pulled a thick stack of legal papers from the briefcase," she wept. "He walked over to the bed. He physically picked up your dying wife's limp hand, wrapped her fingers tightly around a pen, and forced her hand across the pages to sign those documents." I stood frozen, paralyzed by the monstrous nature of her words. The air in the apartment vanished, leaving me suffocating in pure horror. My own flesh and blood had not just stolen my money. He had physically violated his own dying mother for profit. I left Sarah weeping on the floor of her cramped apartment. The heavy wooden door clicked shut behind me. I walked down the dimly lit hallway and stepped out into the biting Colorado air. The drive back toward the heart of Denver was a blur of passing streetlights and empty black asphalt. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my hands ached, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the absolute devastation tearing through my mind. Jason had stood by his mother's deathbed. He watched the monitors beep their final fragile rhythms. Instead of holding her hand in love, he used it as a tool to commit massive financial fraud. The sheer depravity of his actions defied logical comprehension. I pulled into the underground parking garage of Benjamin Carter's law firm just as the sun began to rise over the city skyline. I did not wait for regular business hours. I possessed the executive access codes to the building, a privilege of being one of their highest billing clients. I rode the private elevator up to the top floor. The polished mahogany corridors were silent save for Benjamin, who was sitting at his massive desk reviewing a stack of corporate briefs. He looked up, his brow furrowing, as he registered my appearance. I had not slept in over 24 hours. I was wearing the same dark wool coat, and my face was a mask of cold, unyielding rage. "Richard." "What is wrong?" Benjamin asked, pushing his chair back and standing up. He read the lethal shift in my demeanor. I did not bother with pleasantries. I walked straight up to his desk and placed both my hands flat on the polished wood. "Benjamin, I need you to pull the exact county recorder document filed against my Denver estate. I need the physical copy of the home equity line of credit, and I need to see the authorized signatures right now." Benjamin nodded, recognizing the absolute severity of my tone. He walked over to a secure filing cabinet, entered a digital code, and retrieved a thick manila folder. He brought it back to the desk and laid it flat under the bright glare of his reading lamp. "Here is the certified copy pulled directly from the county registry." He said, his voice lowering into a careful, professional cadence. "The lien was authorized exactly 4 months ago. The amount drawn was $1.2 million. The funds were routed through a secondary escrow account before vanishing entirely into an offshore holding entity. I did not care about the routing numbers or the escrow accounts at that particular moment. My eyes locked onto the bottom of the final page. There, sitting above the printed line for the secondary homeowner authorization, was Catherine's signature. I stared at the blue ink, my breath catching painfully in my throat. Catherine had always possessed a beautiful, elegant signature. Her handwriting was a perfect reflection of her personality. It was graceful, confident, and perfectly balanced. The signature on this legal document was a grotesque, heartbreaking distortion. The lines were jagged and erratic. The pressure of the pen varied wildly, digging deeply into the paper in some spots and barely leaving a mark in others. The letters were dragged across the page with a shaky, disjointed desperation. It was not the signature of a woman willingly taking out a loan. It was the frantic, forced scrawl of a dying woman whose hand was being physically crushed and manipulated by someone else. I traced the ragged ink with my index finger, visualizing the monstrous scene Sarah had described. I pictured Jason, my own son, standing over his mother while she lay trapped in a coma. I pictured him gripping her frail, bruised wrist, forcing the pen down, dragging her fingers across the paper to satisfy the brutal demands of his offshore syndicate. A sudden sharp detail caught my attention. I looked to the left of Catherine's desecrated signature. There was an official notary stamp, complete with a state seal and a bold black signature, verifying the authenticity of the document. A notary public is legally mandated to verify the identity and the clear, uncoerced consent of the individual signing the document. No legitimate notary would ever stamp a multi-million-dollar loan authorized by an unconscious woman in an intensive care unit. Jason had not just committed forgery. He had actively conspired with a corrupt licensed state official. He had brought a dirty notary directly into the hospital room to legitimize the desecration of his mother's final days. He had orchestrated a calculated multi-tiered criminal conspiracy right in front of the medical monitors, keeping my wife alive. The realization that an outsider had participated in this violation added a new layer of absolute disgust to the situation. I slowly closed the manila folder. The silence in the law office was heavy and suffocating. Benjamin stood across the desk, watching me with a mixture of deep sorrow and intense professional concern. He had known Catherine for 20 years. He recognized the forgery the moment I pointed out the date. Richard, Benjamin said quietly, his voice thick with controlled anger. If they executed this document on that specific date, Catherine was entirely incapacitated. This goes far beyond standard financial embezzlement. This is a severe, malicious case of elder abuse and federal wire fraud. I turned away from the desk and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows. I looked out over the sprawling city of Denver. I thought about the decades I had spent building my empire. I thought about the late nights, the high-stakes negotiations, and the endless sacrifices I made to ensure my son would never know the sting of poverty. I had given him every possible advantage. I handed him a life of absolute privilege on a silver platter. In return, he utilized my wealth to fund a degenerate lifestyle, mortgaged my home, to pay off a criminal syndicate, and physically violated his mother on her deathbed to finalize the transaction. Any lingering trace of paternal love, any microscopic shred of forgiveness that might have survived the initial shock evaporated completely. The father who loved Jason died in that room, replaced entirely by a man with absolutely nothing left to lose. I turned back to face Benjamin. My expression was terrifyingly calm. My voice was steady, stripped of all grief, and completely devoid of hesitation. Benjamin, I said, maintaining absolute eye contact. We are not just going to defend my estate. We are not going to settle this quietly to protect the company reputation. I want you to unleash every single legal and financial weapon at our disposal. We are going to track down the corrupt notary who stamped that paper. We are going to dismantle the shadow buyers trying to purchase my home. We are going to tear down the fake reality Jason and Victoria have built. They thought they could erase me. I am going to show them what a real, vicious, hostile takeover looks like. We are going to obliterate them entirely. There will be absolutely no mercy, no quiet settlements, and no second chances for what they did. I did not leave Benjamin to handle the logistics alone. When you are preparing to dismantle your own flesh and blood, you do not delegate the heavy lifting. I authorized Benjamin to dispatch the most aggressive private investigators on his payroll. We needed to find the notary public whose stamp graced that forged home equity line of credit, and we needed to find him before Jason realized his entire financial house of cards was collapsing. The investigators worked relentlessly through the morning, utilizing the digital footprint Vance had uncovered. By noon, they had a name and a verified location. The man who had facilitated the desecration of my dying wife was a licensed notary named Gregory Lawson. He did not operate out of a prestigious downtown law firm or a legitimate banking institution. He ran a dubious, multifaceted shell business from a decaying strip mall on the desolate industrial outskirts of Denver. It was exactly the kind of sleazy transient operation a desperate man like Jason would naturally seek out. We did not call the police. Involving law enforcement at this fragile stage would trigger a bureaucratic process, giving Jason time to lawyer up and spin a defensive narrative. I did not want a prolonged legal battle. I wanted a swift, undeniable execution. Benjamin drove me to the strip mall in his unmarked sedan, accompanied by two massive, silent men from his private security detail. We parked in front of a storefront, boasting faded neon signs that advertised quick cash loans, bail bonds, and cheap notary services. I stepped out of the vehicle, the biting mountain wind whipping violently at my dark wool coat. I instructed the security personnel to secure the front door and flip the open sign to closed. Benjamin and I walked into the cramped, poorly lit office. The air smelled incredibly stale, a disgusting mixture of cheap cologne and old cigarette smoke. Gregory Lawson sat behind a cluttered imitation wood desk. He was a balding, sweating man in a cheap suit, tapping aggressively on a stained keyboard. When he looked up and saw us, his eyes darted nervously to the large men blocking the only exit. He instantly recognized that we were not there for a standard loan application. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" he asked, his voice trembling as he instinctively pushed his chair back away from the desk. I did not answer him immediately. I walked slowly across the stained carpet, letting my sheer presence completely dominate the small room. I stopped directly in front of his desk and stared down at him. "I am Richard Harrison," I said, keeping my voice dangerously low and perfectly even. "4 months ago, my son Jason brought you into an intensive care unit at Denver General Hospital. You stood over the hospital bed of my comatose wife, Catherine. You stamped your official state seal on a document authorizing a $1.2 million home equity line of credit against my fully paid-off estate." Lawson swallowed hard, the color completely draining from his pale face. He held up his hands in a pathetic gesture of defense. "Mr. Harrison," he stammered, heavy sweat beginning to bead on his forehead. "I am just a notary. Your son hired me for a standard mobile service. He assured me everything was legally sound and that your wife was fully consenting to the transaction." I dropped a thick, heavy manila folder directly onto his keyboard. The loud smack echoed off the cheap, paneled walls. I leaned over the desk, invading his personal space. "Do not insult my intelligence, Gregory," I whispered. "We ran a full forensic audit on your operation this morning. This folder contains a meticulously documented history of your fraudulent activities over the last 5 years. Fake vehicle titles, forged property transfers, and bribed signatures. My attorneys have compiled enough evidence to guarantee you will spend the next 2 decades in a maximum security federal prison for wire fraud and conspiracy to commit elder abuse." Lawson stared at the folder as if it were a live explosive device. He began to hyperventilate, his eyes darting frantically around the room, searching for an escape that simply did not exist. "Please," he begged, his voice cracking into a pathetic whine. "I was broke. Your son paid me $10,000 in pure cash just to look the other way. He told me the bank was pushing for the paperwork and that it was just a technicality. I did not want to hurt anyone." "You did not just hurt someone," I replied, my tone as cold as liquid nitrogen. "You violated a dying woman. You participated in a multi-million-dollar syndicate conspiracy. Right now, my attorneys are prepared to hand this entire dossier over to the district attorney. You will lose your license, your freedom, and your life. However, I am a pragmatic man. I am willing to offer you exactly one chance to save yourself." Lawson nodded frantically, tears of absolute panic welling in his eyes. "Anything," he gasped. "I will do anything you want." I stepped back, adjusting my coat. Benjamin stepped forward, placing a small, highly advanced digital recording wire on the desk next to the folder. "You are going to call my son right now," Benjamin instructed smoothly. "You are going to tell him that the bank is asking questions about the secondary mortgage signature. You are going to demand an immediate in-person meeting to get your story straight. You will wear this wire to that meeting. You will get Jason to explicitly admit on tape that he forced his mother to sign that document while she was incapacitated. If you get his full confession, this folder disappears. If you fail, or if you try to warn him, you will be arrested before you can even leave the parking lot. Lawson did exactly as he was told. Fear is a spectacular motivator. 2 hours later, Benjamin and I were sitting in the back of a discreet surveillance van parked a block away from an upscale downtown coffee shop. Lawson was sitting inside a private booth wearing the hidden wire waiting for Jason. The audio feed piped clearly through our encrypted receivers. Within 10 minutes, Jason arrived. I could hear the sharp scraping of a chair as he sat down aggressively across from the terrified notary. "What is the problem, Gregory?" Jason hissed, his voice tight with paranoid irritation. "I paid you $10,000 to guarantee that paperwork was ironclad. Why are you calling me in a panic? The bank is doing a routine compliance check." Lawson lied flawlessly, his voice shaking just enough to sound authentically terrified. "They are asking about the medical state of the co-signer on the day the lien was approved. Jason, you told me your mother was lucid. If they investigate the hospital logs, they are going to see that she was in the intensive care unit. We need a story to protect both of us." Jason let out a harsh, condescending laugh. It was a sound that made my blood run entirely cold. "You are panicking over nothing." "Gregory," my son sneered, his voice dripping with arrogant confidence. "The hospital logs do not matter. The bank only cares about the physical signature, and the signature is perfectly valid because I made sure her hand held the pen. She was completely comatose. She had absolutely no idea what was happening. I practically had to break her fingers to drag the ink across the signature line, but it worked. And as for my father, you do not need to worry about him asking any questions. By this time tomorrow, the judge will grant my emergency medical conservatorship. The old man will be locked away in a secure dementia ward by Friday afternoon. He will be heavily medicated, completely stripped of his legal rights, and completely powerless. He will never find out about the loan, and you get to keep your money. Just stay quiet and let me handle the rest." I sat in the dark surveillance van listening to my own son gleefully confess to the physical abuse of my dying wife. The audio recording had perfectly captured his entire monstrous reality. The trap had not just sprung shut, it had decapitated him. The trap had not just sprung shut, it had decapitated him. I took off the surveillance headphones and handed them to Benjamin across the dim interior of the communications van. The audio recording of my son casually admitting to assaulting his dying mother played on a continuous, agonizing loop in my mind. Benjamin looked at me, a silent question hanging in his sharp eyes. I gave him a single, definitive nod. The legal foundation was completely solidified. Now, it was time for the theatrical execution. I stepped out of the surveillance van and got back into my vehicle. The drive to my Denver estate felt entirely different this time. The crushing weight of grief had been completely replaced by the cold, mechanical precision of a demolition. I parked my vehicle in the winding driveway and sat behind the steering wheel for a long, quiet moment. I needed to shift my posture, my breathing, and the very light in my eyes. I had to become the pathetic, broken old man they desperately wanted me to be. I had to swallow my absolute disgust and play the part perfectly. I unlocked the heavy front oak door and pushed it open. I let my shoulders slump forward, rounding my spine to mimic the physical weight of total exhaustion. I dragged my feet slightly across the hardwood floor, ensuring my footsteps sounded hesitant, slow, and unsure. The house was brightly lit, a stark contrast to the dark reality of what was about to happen inside it. As soon as I crossed the threshold into the expansive living room, they pounced. Jason and Victoria were sitting on the expensive leather sofa, waiting like vultures circling a dying animal in the desert. A thick stack of legal documents rested on the glass coffee table, perfectly squared and ready for execution. Jason stood up immediately, smoothing his designer tie with nervous, eager hands. His eyes swept over my hunched posture, and I could practically see the greedy satisfaction radiating from his pores. He thought the weekend counseling retreat had successfully broken my spirit. He thought I was finally ready to surrender everything to his demands. Dad. Jason said, his voice laced with a sickeningly fake warmth that made my stomach turn. We were starting to get genuinely worried about you. How was the grief counseling retreat in the mountains? I let out a long, ragged sigh, waving my hand weakly in the empty air. It was overwhelmingly difficult, I murmured, keeping my gaze fixed firmly on the floor, to hide the sharp, calculating focus in my eyes. There is just so much pain in my heart. I do not think I have the strength to manage all of this on my own anymore. The house is simply too quiet without your mother here. Victoria stood up gracefully and walked toward me, her heels clicking softly against the floor. She placed a gentle, patronizing hand on my shoulder. She looked at me with wide, pitiful eyes, adopting a tone usually reserved for speaking to a confused, frightened toddler. "We know, Richard," she cooed, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness and toxic concern. "It is simply too much for you to handle. You have been through such a terrible trauma, and your poor mind desperately needs to rest. That is exactly why Jason and I have taken care of absolutely everything for you. We want to protect you." She gestured elegantly toward the glass coffee table, her diamond rings catching the overhead light. "It is for your own good, Dad," she continued, leaning in closer so I could smell her overwhelmingly expensive perfume. "We have the emergency medical conservatorship papers right here, completely ready to go. And we went ahead and finalized the immediate sale contract for the house to take that heavy, stressful burden off your shoulders. The cash buyers are waiting at the brokerage downtown right now. Just sign these papers and the nice doctors from Silver Pines will come pick you up this afternoon. You will be so comfortable there, surrounded by people who can give you the proper medical attention you so desperately need." The sheer audacity of her condescension made my blood boil in my veins. She was speaking to a man who had orchestrated multi-million-dollar commercial real estate acquisitions for 4 decades, as if I were a helpless child incapable of tying my own shoes. They were attempting to cage me with sweet words, false sympathy, and a prison disguised as a luxury nursing home. I looked at the thick stack of papers resting ominously on the coffee table. The conservatorship forms granting total control, the property transfer deeds signing away my castle, the legal instruments of my own destruction, all printed neatly on crisp white paper. I slowly walked toward the sofa and lowered myself onto the plush cushions, letting out a small, painful groan to further sell the illusion of my rapid physical decline. Jason stepped forward, pulling a heavy silver pen from his jacket pocket. He held it out toward me, his hand hovering in the space between us. "We can make this very easy. Dad," he said, his voice tightening with suppressed urgency and hidden panic. He could taste the millions of dollars. He could feel the ruthless offshore syndicate lifting the terrifying weight off his shoulders. "Just put your name on the dotted lines, and you will never have to worry about a single bill or a single responsibility ever again. I will handle the company operations. I will handle the estate finances. You just need to let go and trust us to do what is best for the family. We just want you to be safe and secure." I reached out with a trembling, age-worn hand and took the silver pen from his eager grasp. I held it loosely between my fingers, letting it hover above the signature line. I stared at the sharp metal tip for a long, agonizing moment, playing the role of a defeated king, preparing to formally surrender his hard-earned crown. I could feel their greedy eyes burning into the side of my head, silently begging me to drag the ink across the page. I slowly reached up and took off my reading glasses, letting them fall carelessly onto the table beside the stack of documents. I looked directly into the eyes of my son, dropping the final piece of the bait. I let out the heaviest defeated sigh I could possibly muster, allowing my shoulders to collapse entirely against the back of the sofa. "You are absolutely right about everything," I whispered, my voice completely hollow and utterly devoid of any remaining fight whatsoever. "I simply cannot handle this tremendous pressure anymore. The terrible grief is far too heavy, and I am just so incredibly tired of fighting the inevitable conclusion. I will agree to sign everything today, but only in front of the official brokers. I want to do this officially properly with the new buyers physically present in the room with us. Jason offered me a triumphant, arrogant smirk, absolutely convinced that he had finally won the ultimate victory over his completely clueless old father today. The drive to the upscale real estate brokerage the following afternoon was a masterclass in silent psychological warfare. I sat in the spacious leather back seat of Jason's luxury sedan, staring blankly out the tinted window. I kept my shoulders hunched deliberately, allowing my hands to tremble slightly, where they rested on my knees. I was projecting the perfect image of a broken man who had finally surrendered to the crushing weight of his own perceived cognitive decline. In the front seats, the atmosphere was entirely different. The air was thick with a palpable electric current of greedy anticipation. Jason gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, practically buzzing with a frantic adrenaline-fueled energy. He was driving slightly above the speed limit, eagerly racing toward what he believed was his ultimate financial salvation. Beside him in the passenger seat, Victoria was not even attempting to hide her predatory excitement. She was casually scrolling through her smartphone, her manicured thumb swiping rapidly across the glowing screen. The reflection in the rearview mirror revealed exactly what she was doing. She was actively browsing digital catalogs for luxury European sports cars, meticulously comparing custom interior options and paint colors. She was already spending the bloody spoils of my liquidation before the ink had even touched the paper. The breathtaking audacity of her behavior would have enraged me 24 hours ago. Now it reinforced the absolute necessity of the execution I was about to deliver. They were parasitic entities gleefully preparing to feast on a carcass, entirely unaware the corpse was a trap. We pulled into the sleek underground parking garage of a prominent commercial high-rise located in the very heart of the financial district. Jason parked the vehicle and practically leaped out to open my door, his movements sharp and aggressively helpful. He placed a firm hand on my elbow, steering me toward the private elevators with the patronizing caution reserved for handling fragile glass. "Take your time, Dad," he murmured, his voice dripping with that same toxic artificial sweetness. "We are almost at the finish line. Everything is going to be so much easier for you after today." I simply nodded slowly, keeping my eyes downcast as we stepped into the polished chrome elevator car. The brokerage office on the 30th floor was a temple of modern corporate wealth. The lobby featured imported marble flooring and massive floor-to-ceiling windows offering a view of the Rocky Mountains. The receptionist greeted Jason by name, offering a polite, practiced smile before immediately leading us down a long hallway lined with frosted glass walls. We were ushered into the primary executive conference room at the end of the corridor. The space was intimidatingly large, dominated by a massive polished mahogany table surrounded by heavy ergonomic leather chairs. 3 men were already seated on the far side of the table. They were dressed in sharp, expensive suits, but they did not look like standard real estate investors or corporate acquisition managers. Their posture was overly rigid, their eyes were cold and calculating, and they lacked the polished charisma typical of high-level Denver brokers. They carried the distinct heavy aura of professional enforcers wearing expensive disguises. These were the front men for the offshore shadow syndicate. These were the debt collectors Jason had summoned to quietly absorb my $3 million estate in exchange for clearing his catastrophic cryptocurrency liabilities. Jason immediately stepped forward, greeting the men with a series of aggressive, overly enthusiastic handshakes. He was trying desperately to project the image of a peer, an equal player in their high-stakes game. The men barely registered his enthusiasm. Their cold, flat gazes bypassed my son entirely and locked directly onto me. They evaluated my hunched posture and my slow, deliberate movements with quiet, predatory satisfaction. They saw an easy mark. They saw an old, defenseless man who was about to sign away his entire fortune without putting up a single shred of resistance. "Please have a seat right here, Dad," Victoria cooed, pulling out a heavy chair at the head of the table. She gently guided me down into the seat, hovering over my shoulder like a devoted caretaker. The lead representative from the syndicate slid a thick, meticulously organized stack of legal documents across the smooth mahogany surface. The papers stopped perfectly aligned directly in front of me. The documents represent the final property transfer deeds, the lead buyer stated, his gravelly baritone echoing slightly in the large glass room. The funds have already been staged in an independent escrow account. Once the signatures are fully executed and notarized today, the liquid capital will be released immediately to clear all existing liens and satisfy the remaining balance to your son. We are prepared to conclude this transaction now. Jason moved to stand directly beside my chair. He reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a heavy, gleaming Mont Blanc fountain pen. It was a gift I had given him 5 years ago for his corporate promotion. He clicked the cap off with a decisive snap, placing the expensive pen gently into my trembling right hand. "Just sign on the highlighted yellow tabs, Dad," Jason whispered, leaning down so his mouth was hovering just inches from my ear. His breath was hot and reeked of stale coffee and pure, unadulterated anxiety. "Just put your name on those lines, and this entire nightmare will finally be over. You can rest. I will take care of the rest of the details. I promise you." I sat there in the heavy silence of the glass-walled conference room. I held the Mont Blanc pen loosely between my fingers. I looked down at the crisp white paper, staring at the bold black letters, spelling out the surrender of my home, my wealth, and my autonomy. I could feel the collective, breathless anticipation of every single person in that room. Jason was holding his breath. Victoria was gripping the back of my chair. The syndicate men were leaning forward, their eyes completely fixed on the silver tip of the pen in my hand. They all believed they had reached the triumphant conclusion of their malicious conspiracy. They believed the old man was finally broken. I slowly lifted my head. I straightened my spine, rolling my shoulders back until my posture was perfectly rigid. The manufactured trembling in my hands ceased, instantly replaced by absolute stillness. I turned the expensive Mont Blanc pen over in my hand, examining the polished silver barrel with slow, deliberate precision. I looked directly into Jason's eyes. The false, patronizing warmth in his expression faltered rapidly, replaced by a sudden, creeping confusion. I raised my arm and casually tossed the heavy silver pen across the room. It hit the side of a metal trash can with a sharp, echoing clang and dropped inside. "I am not signing anything," I announced, my voice dropping an octave, ringing out with the ruthless authority of the commercial real estate king they had tried to bury. Before anyone could process the sudden shift in my demeanor, a heavy metallic sound echoed through the space. The electronic locks on the thick glass doors clicked shut from the outside. The sharp mechanical sound of the heavy deadbolts engaging echoed through the conference room like a gunshot. The 3 men sitting across the mahogany table froze, their predatory confidence instantly vanishing. Jason blinked, his arrogant smirk melting into a mask of utter confusion. "What are you doing?" Jason asked, his voice trembling as he took a hesitant step toward the head of the table. "We need to finish this transaction right now." I did not answer him. I kept my eyes locked onto his, letting the suffocating silence stretch until the air in the room felt too thick to breathe. Before Jason could demand another explanation, the interior oak door located at the back of the executive suite swung open. Benjamin Carter stepped into the room. He was not alone. Flanking him were 2 tall, broad-shouldered men wearing sharp, unassuming gray suits. They moved with a synchronized, tactical precision that immediately identified them as seasoned law enforcement officers. The lead representative from the Shadow Syndicate stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the polished hardwood floor. "This meeting is over," the man growled, reaching for his leather portfolio. "Unlock those doors right now, or we are going to have a very serious problem." The 2 men in gray suits stepped forward simultaneously, blocking the only exit path to the interior hallway. "Federal Bureau of Investigation, Financial Crimes Division." The agent stated, his voice a flat, uncompromising baritone. "Nobody is leaving this room today. Take your hands off the portfolio and step back from the table immediately." The color completely drained from Jason's face. Victoria let out a short, terrified gasp, her manicured hands flying up to cover her mouth. The swagger, the entitlement, and the arrogant confidence that had defined their existence for the past 3 weeks evaporated entirely. I stood up from my chair, taking absolute command of the room. I reached down and picked up my heavy leather briefcase, placing it squarely in the center of the mahogany table. I popped the brass latches, the metallic clicks ringing out in the dead silence. I reached inside and pulled out the thick black folder Vance and his Black Ops accounting team had prepared for me. "This is not a real estate closing," I announced, my voice steady and completely stripped of mercy. "This is an execution." I opened the folder and pulled out the first stack of documents. I threw them across the smooth wood, letting the pages fan out directly in front of the three syndicate men. "Those are the complete unredacted forensic audits of your offshore holding accounts," I told them, watching their eyes widen as they recognized their own hidden routing numbers. My team traced every single digital transaction, every leveraged cryptocurrency loss, and every fraudulent wire transfer my son initiated over the past 14 months. The Federal Bureau of Investigation now possesses the exact coordinates of your entire shadow lending network. You came here today to collect a $2.5 million debt. Instead, you have just walked directly into a federal racketeering indictment. The three men did not say a word. They slowly raised their hands, submitting to the agents who moved in to secure their wrists in heavy steel cuffs. I turned my attention back to my son. Jason was trembling so violently that his knees appeared ready to buckle underneath him. He looked at the federal agents, then at Benjamin, and finally back at me, his eyes pleading for a rescue that was never going to come. Jason choked out tears of absolute panic streaming down his pale cheeks. "I can explain all of this. I was trapped. I did not want to do any of it. You have to help me. You are my father. Please call them off." I reached back into the black folder. I pulled out the high-resolution photographs of the home equity line of credit document. I threw the photographs onto the table, letting the terrifying image of Catherine's jagged, forced signature stare back at him. "I am not your father," I replied, my tone as cold as a mountain blizzard. "A son might make a terrible financial mistake. A son might even attempt to steal from his family out of sheer desperation. But a son does not walk into an intensive care unit, stand over the fragile, comatose body of his dying mother, and physically crush her fingers around a pen to forge a multi-million-dollar loan." Jason let out a gutted, pathetic wail, realizing that I knew the darkest, most depraved secret he possessed. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small digital audio player. I placed it gently on the table and pressed the playback button. The crisp, clear audio of Gregory Lawson's wiretap filled the conference room. Jason's own arrogant, sneering voice echoed through the space, bragging about breaking his mother's fingers to drag the ink across the page. The recording continued, broadcasting his gleeful plan to lock me away in a dementia ward by Friday afternoon, so I would never discover his monumental fraud. I stopped the playback. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, and entirely final. "You thought you were a brilliant tactician, Jason," I said, leaning forward until I was just inches from his weeping face. "You thought I was just a clueless, grieving old man who would blindly sign away my empire. But you forgot who built that empire. You forgot that I have spent 40 years destroying men far smarter, far richer, and far more dangerous than you. You tried to bury me alive, but you handed me the shovel." The federal agents finished securing the syndicate members and signaled to the lobby. The heavy glass doors unlocked, and 4 more uniformed officers streamed into the conference room to take custody of the prisoners. 2 agents stepped directly behind Jason, grabbing his arms and pulling them harshly behind his back. The sharp, metallic ratcheting of the handcuffs locking around his wrists sounded like the ultimate gavel striking the sounding block. Victoria had backed herself into the farthest corner of the room, her entire body shaking uncontrollably. She watched the officers secure her husband, her eyes darting frantically between the federal agents, the damning evidence on the table, and my cold, unyielding expression. The reality of her situation crashed down upon her. The luxury cars, the designer clothes, and the lavish socialite facade were instantly replaced by the terrifying, unavoidable specter of a federal prison sentence. She saw her entire existence turning to ash, and in a final desperate act of absolute self-preservation, the loyal wife persona shattered completely. Victoria violently pushed herself away from the glass wall, pointing a trembling, manicured finger directly at her husband. It was all him, Victoria screamed, her voice shrill and echoing wildly off the polished mahogany table as the federal agents moved to secure her hands. He made me do it. I did not know anything about the forgery in the hospital. I did not know he hurt Catherine. He lied to me completely. He forced me to go along with the conservatorship. You have to believe me. I am a victim too. Victoria's words sliced through the heavy air of the conference room. I watched my son's face as the absolute reality of her betrayal finally registered in his wide eyes. The woman he had mortgaged his soul to satisfy was now frantically offering him up as a sacrificial lamb to save her own skin. Jason stared at her, unable to articulate the profound depth of his shock. The federal agents ignored their dispute. They moved with swift, uncompromising efficiency. One agent grasped Victoria by the arm, reciting her Miranda rights in a flat monotone that drowned out her hysterical sobbing. The other two agents tightened their grip on Jason, dragging his hands behind his back. The sharp click of the steel handcuffs engaging around his wrists broke the invisible spell holding him upright. His legs simply gave out beneath him. Jason collapsed heavily onto the polished hardwood floor, landing hard on his knees in the middle of the upscale boardroom. The tailored suit he wore, like a suit of armor, now looked like a pathetic costume on a broken child. He twisted his body, straining against the unyielding grip of the federal agents, and looked up at me. His face was a mask of pure terror. Tears streamed down his cheeks, pooling around the collar of his expensive shirt. "Dad!" he choked out, his voice cracking into a raw wail. "Dad, please do not do this to me. You cannot just stand there and let them take me away. I am your son. We are family. We share the same blood. You have to call them off. You have to tell them this is all just a terrible corporate misunderstanding. I will do anything you want. I will give up the position and walk away from the company entirely. Please do not let them put me in a cage." I stood at the head of the long mahogany table, looking down at the weeping man kneeling on the floor. I searched my own heart, looking for even a trace of the paternal instinct that governed my entire life. I looked for the father who had proudly paid his business school tuition, the father who had blindly handed him the keys to a commercial real estate empire. I found absolutely nothing. That father had been completely eradicated. He had been murdered in a sterile hospital room exactly 4 months ago. In his place stood a man forged of cold, unyielding iron. I did not flinch at his tears. I did not soften at his desperate pleas. I simply stared at him with absolute zero emotion, letting the weight of my silence press down on his breaking shoulders. Family. I repeated this word, tasting like ash in my mouth. My voice was dangerously quiet, yet carried across the room with lethal clarity. You dare invoke the concept of family to me now, Jason. A family protects its own. A family builds a legacy together. You do not know the first thing about family. You are a parasite who disguised himself in an expensive suit to bleed me dry. I slowly walked around the table until I was standing directly over him. I looked down into his wide, panicked eyes. You lost the right to call me family the second you put a pen in your dying mother's hand. You lost the right to my blood the moment you physically forced a comatose woman to finance your degenerate gambling debts. You are not my son anymore. You are just a criminal who made the fatal mistake of trying to rob the wrong man. Jason flinched as if I had physically struck him across the face. He let out an agonizing moan, dropping his chin to his chest, as he realized no amount of begging was going to save him from the execution block. But I was not finished. The federal agents had secured his physical freedom, but I was there to sever his connection to my empire. I turned back to my open leather briefcase resting on the table. I pulled out 2 crisp, notarized legal documents. I laid them on the mahogany surface directly in his line of sight. Benjamin Carter stepped forward, assuming his role as corporate executioner. He looked down at Jason with deep, professional disgust. Jason Harrison. Benjamin stated formally, his voice leaving no room for debate. As the majority shareholder and acting chief executive officer of the firm, your father is hereby exercising his executive authority. You are officially terminated from your position as vice president effective immediately. Due to your documented engagement in severe financial fraud against the primary corporate entity, we are enforcing the catastrophic breach clause in your employment contract. I watched Jason's eyes dart toward the papers on the table. I picked up my own pen, the one I had brought from my private study, and pressed the tip against the bottom of the first document. I signed my name with sharp, aggressive strokes, legally severing his employment. I moved to the second document. This is the immediate corporate dissolution of your minority shares, I explained, signing the second line with equal precision. Your equity in my company is hereby seized to partially cover the massive financial damages you have caused. You no longer hold a title, you no longer possess an office, and you no longer own a single fraction of a % of my life's work. You are leaving this room with absolutely nothing. The finality of the signatures drained the last ounce of fight from his body. The federal agents hauled Jason roughly to his feet, pulling him up by his handcuffed arms. He swayed unsteadily, staring blankly at the glass walls of the conference room. The complete horrifying reality of his situation was finally crashing down upon him in real time. He was not just losing his luxurious lifestyle. He was now facing catastrophic federal charges for wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit elder abuse. The federal prosecutors were going to bury him under decades of mandatory minimum sentencing. But the legal system was only half of his nightmare. As the agents turned him toward the door, his eyes briefly met the cold, dead stares of the 3 Shadow Syndicate men standing against the far wall in their own handcuffs. Jason owed their superiors $2.5 million. He had no house to sell, no corporate funds to raid, and zero protection from my legal team. He was entirely exposed, massively in debt to ruthless criminals and heading straight to federal prison. Victoria was dragged out first, still weeping, and desperately trying to bargain with the stoic agents leading her down the corridor. Jason followed a moment later. He did not say another word. He did not look back at me. He shuffled out of the glass room, a completely hollowed-out shell of a man marching directly into the inferno of his own making. The heavy doors closed behind them, leaving Benjamin and me standing in the sudden ringing quiet of the brokerage office. The execution was complete. The cancer had been successfully excised from my empire. The execution was complete. The cancer had been successfully excised from my empire. I walked out of the high-rise building and stepped into the crisp mountain air of downtown Denver. The biting cold felt incredibly refreshing against my skin. For the first time in weeks, my lungs expanded fully, taking in deep breaths. I got into my vehicle and started the heavy engine. The drive back to my estate was entirely devoid of the suffocating anxiety that had plagued me hours earlier. I navigated the familiar winding roads leading up to the affluent neighborhood, watching the manicured lawns and tall trees pass by. When I pulled into my driveway, the imposing structure of my home loomed ahead. It was the fortress I had meticulously built. I unlocked the heavy front door and stepped inside. I stood in the grand foyer listening to the profound silence of the empty house. Just yesterday, this silence had felt like a heavy blanket of grief. It had been a constant reminder of Catherine slipping away from my grasp. But now the atmosphere had fundamentally shifted. The silence was clean and utterly victorious. The parasitic entities that had tried to steal my life were currently sitting in sterile federal interrogation rooms. I walked slowly through the expansive living room, my footsteps echoing softly against the imported Italian marble floors. I looked at the extravagant velvet sofas, the towering crystal chandeliers, and the priceless modern art hanging on the painted walls. I had purchased all of these magnificent things over the years, simply to satisfy the endless entitled expectations of a son who only measured love in dollar signs. Jason and Victoria had looked at this magnificent home and seen nothing but a massive piggy bank waiting to be opened. They saw only their own unearned inheritance. I did not want any of it anymore. The opulent furniture and the expensive decorations were nothing more than the hollow trappings of a life built for ungrateful children. I walked past the grand dining table where Jason had arrogantly demanded I surrender my freedom just 24 hours ago. I did not feel a shred of attachment to the material wealth surrounding me. I proceeded directly into my private study and retrieved a sturdy leather duffel bag from the hall closet. I was only going to take the absolute essentials required for my new life moving forward. I walked over to the mahogany bookshelf and carefully took down the framed portrait of Catherine. Her smile was bright and filled with profound warmth. I wrapped the silver frame in a soft cloth and placed it gently into the bottom of the bag. Next, I moved to my liquor cabinet and retrieved an unopened bottle of my favorite single malt scotch. It was a bottle I had been saving for a monumental occasion. Surviving a hostile takeover by my own flesh and blood qualified perfectly. Finally, I knelt beside the hidden floor safe, unlocked the heavy steel door, and retrieved the $400,000 in banded cash, along with the secret Wyoming property deed. I packed the thick stacks of currency securely into the side compartments of the luggage. My entire meaningful existence was now neatly packed away. As I zipped the bag closed, my encrypted smartphone vibrated sharply on the oak desk. I picked it up and saw Benjamin Carter calling from his secure line. I answered the phone, my voice steady and calm. Richard Benjamin, began his tone, carrying the crisp edge of a lawyer who had just won a massive victory. I wanted to give you an immediate update on the arraignment proceedings. The federal judge just ruled on the bail hearings for Jason and Victoria. Tell me the results, I replied, looking out over the sprawling lawn. Jason was completely denied bail. Benjamin stated, a hint of grim satisfaction bleeding into his professional demeanor. The federal prosecutors presented the wiretap audio and the forensic financial audit directly to the magistrate. Because Jason possesses active ties to a dangerous offshore criminal syndicate, the judge deemed him an extreme flight risk. He will remain in federal custody in a maximum security holding facility for the entire duration of the trial. And Victoria, I asked, feeling absolutely no sympathy for the woman who had eagerly plotted to lock me in a dementia ward. Victoria attempted to secure a plea deal by offering to testify against your son, Benjamin explained. However, the prosecutors already possess an overwhelming mountain of irrefutable evidence. They do not need her testimony to secure a conviction against Jason. Because she actively utilized corporate funds and knowingly participated in the conspiracy to defraud your estate, she is charged as a primary accessory. The federal guidelines for her specific charges carry a mandatory minimum sentence of 10 years in federal prison. Her parents are trying to liquidate their retirement accounts to afford her legal defense, but it is a losing battle. Thank you, Benjamin, I said, my voice completely devoid of any wavering emotion. You executed the strategy perfectly. Keep monitoring the situation and ensure the corporate transition continues smoothly. I am leaving the city today. I ended the call and slipped the phone into my jacket pocket. My son was sitting in a cold concrete cell, stripped of his expensive suits and his unearned arrogance. He was finally facing the brutal, uncompromising reality of his own catastrophic decisions. I felt a profound sense of closure wash over me. The venomous tumor had been completely eradicated from my bloodline. I picked up the heavy leather duffel bag and walked out of the study. As I stepped back into the grand foyer, a large commercial moving truck pulled through the wrought iron gates at the end of the driveway. It was followed closely by a sleek silver sedan belonging to the most aggressive real estate broker in the Denver area. I opened the front doors and stepped out onto the expansive stone porch. The broker, a sharp man named Thomas, walked briskly up the steps carrying a polished leather clipboard. Mr. Harrison, Thomas said, extending a firm hand. It is an absolute privilege to work with you. I have already run the preliminary market analysis. This property is pristine. We can list it on the open market immediately. I shook his hand firmly. That is exactly what I want, Thomas. Sell everything. The house, the imported furniture, the custom art. Liquidate the entire estate. I do not want a single piece of this property remaining in my name. Thomas opened his clipboard and presented the exclusive listing agreement. I clicked my pen and signed my name with bold, decisive strokes across the bottom line. I was not executing a fire sale to appease a criminal syndicate. I was conducting a highly lucrative legal transaction on the open market. I handed the paperwork back to the broker, ensuring that the proceeds would completely bypass Jason and flow directly into my newly established estate trust. They were never getting my legacy. I grabbed my bag, walked down the stone steps, and moved toward my waiting vehicle, completely ready to leave this poisoned city behind forever. I opened the door of my sport utility vehicle and tossed the leather duffel bag onto the passenger seat. The satisfying thud of the bag hitting the upholstery felt like the final punctuation mark on a long chapter of my life. I climbed into the driver's seat, the scent of rich leather providing a sudden comfort. I pressed the ignition button, and the powerful engine roared to life, a steady hum that resonated in my chest. I shifted the vehicle into drive and pulled away from the curb. I drove down the tree-lined streets of the upscale Denver neighborhood for the last time. I passed the sprawling mansions, the manicured lawns, and the security patrols that defined this enclave. This was a place built for people who measured their worth by the address on their mailboxes. I had been one of those people for decades. Now the entire neighborhood looked like a meticulously decorated graveyard. I did not look at the rearview mirror. I did not steal one nostalgic glance at the $3 million fortress I was leaving behind. The man who cared about that house had died alongside his wife. I merged onto Interstate 25 North, the wide highway stretching out like a gray ribbon under the bright Colorado sun. Traffic was light, allowing me to settle into a steady cruising speed. The towering skyscrapers of downtown Denver began to shrink behind me, their glass facades reflecting the harsh afternoon light. Those buildings represented the battlegrounds of my past. I had spent 40 years waging brutal corporate warfare in those boardrooms. I had destroyed rival developers, engineered massive commercial buyouts, and amassed a fortune that most men could only dream of. I had done it all under the guise of providing security for my family. I wanted to ensure that my son would never have to experience the humiliating sting of poverty that I had endured as a young man. I wanted to build an impenetrable financial wall around my bloodline. As the miles rolled by and the urban sprawl gave way to open plains, a bitter realization washed over me. My immense wealth had not protected my family. It had actively poisoned them. I had constructed a golden cage of privilege, and inside that cage my son had mutated into a monster. Jason never had to struggle for survival, so he never developed a moral compass. He never had to earn his standing, so he never understood the value of integrity. I had handed him a life completely devoid of consequences, and that environment bred a terrifying entitlement. He viewed my fortune not as a legacy to be respected, but as a resource to be plundered. The money I had bled for had ultimately financed his degeneration. It was a devastating truth for a father to swallow, but I let the pain burn through me. I accepted it. Denial was the very weakness that had allowed Jason to blindside me in the first place. I would never be blind again. The steady hum of the highway tires provided a therapeutic rhythm to my dark thoughts. I tightened my grip on the leather steering wheel, feeling a sudden, overwhelming wave of gratitude for Catherine. While I was busy conquering the Denver real estate market, my brilliant wife had been quietly observing the decay inside our own home. She had seen the arrogant entitlement taking root in Jason. She had seen the dangerous, manipulative influence of Victoria. Catherine knew that when she passed away, I would be entirely vulnerable to my own paternal blind spots. She understood that my instinct would be to trust our son to hand over the reins of the empire in a misguided attempt to heal our shared grief. So she used her final months on Earth to meticulously forge a magnificent shield. She liquidated her personal trust, secured the untraceable cash, and purchased the hidden sanctuary. She reached from beyond the grave to pull me out of a burning building I did not even realize was on fire. The landscape outside my window began to shift dramatically as I approached the state line. The flat, sprawling plains gradually gave way to rolling foothills, the precursors to the rugged, untamed mountains that defined the American West. The sky seemed to expand, growing wider, and a deeper, more vibrant shade of blue. I passed the large green sign welcoming me to Wyoming. The moment my vehicle crossed that invisible border, a heavy, suffocating pressure instantly evaporated from my chest. The toxic, suffocating atmosphere of Denver, with its corporate deceit, its false high society, and the suffocating memory of the ultimate betrayal by my son, was entirely severed. I was entering a territory where the rules were fundamentally different. This was a place of isolation, of harsh natural beauty, and of profound silence. It was exactly what my battered soul required. I drove for another 2 hours navigating a series of increasingly remote state highways. The paved roads eventually transitioned into packed gravel, sending a plume of white dust billowing behind my vehicle. My smartphone lost its cellular signal, severing my final digital tether to the outside world. I was completely off the grid. The coordinates Catherine had carefully written in her final letter guided me through a dense, towering forest of ancient pine trees. The shadows cast by the branches danced across the hood of my vehicle, providing a cooling relief from the glaring afternoon sun. The gravel path narrowed significantly, forcing me to reduce my speed as I navigated the winding, uneven terrain. Finally, the dense tree line broke, opening up into a massive, breathtaking clearing. I brought the vehicle to a slow, deliberate halt. Directly in front of me stood a towering, rustic wooden gate constructed from massive, unpeeled timber logs. Heavy iron chains secured the center of the structure, locked tightly with a thick, weathered brass padlock. The gate stretched across the entrance of a private valley, flanked by jagged stone peaks that pierced the bright blue sky. This was it. This was the fortress Catherine had built for me. I shifted the vehicle into park and turned off the ignition. I stepped out of the idling vehicle. The silence of the Wyoming wilderness was absolute, broken only by the wind passing through the pines. The air was crisp, smelling of raw earth and pine needles. I walked slowly up to the wooden gate, reaching into the pocket of my dark wool coat. My fingers brushed against the brass key I had retrieved from the bank vault earlier. I pulled it out and slid it into the base of the heavy padlock. I turned the key, and the internal mechanism clicked open with a satisfying snap. I unwound the heavy iron chains, letting them fall to the dirt with a loud clatter. I pushed the massive gates open, the rusted hinges groaning softly as they swung wide, granting me total access to my new kingdom. I stood there looking out over the hundreds of acres of untouched, isolated land. I inhaled deeply, filling my lungs with the mountain air, and for the first time in 40 years, I felt true freedom. I left the heavy iron chains resting in the thick dust and drove my vehicle slowly through the newly opened gates. The gravel driveway wound its way gracefully through a thick grove of towering aspen trees, their white bark glowing softly in the fading afternoon light. As I rounded the final sweeping bend, the main house finally came into clear, breathtaking view. It was a magnificent, sprawling log cabin built from massive hand-hewn timber, sitting perfectly elevated on a rocky ridge that overlooked the entire valley below. A wide wraparound wooden porch circled the massive structure, offering unobstructed, magnificent panoramic views of the jagged mountain peaks in the distance. This was not just a piece of real estate. It was a fortress of absolute peace and quiet. Catherine had designed it to be completely impregnable, both financially and physically. I parked my vehicle near the front stone steps and turned off the powerful engine. I sat in the quiet cabin for a long moment, simply listening to the profound, healing silence of the Wyoming wilderness. There were no loud sirens, no ringing cell phones, and absolutely no greedy voices demanding a piece of my tired soul. I grabbed my heavy leather duffel bag from the passenger seat and walked slowly up the sturdy wooden steps. The brass key Catherine had left in the bank vault slid perfectly into the heavy lock on the front oak door. The mechanism turned smoothly, and I pushed the heavy door open, stepping inside. The interior of the cabin was truly undeniably breathtaking. High vaulted ceilings featured exposed wooden beams, and a massive river-stone fireplace dominated the exact center of the spacious living room. The furniture was rustic, exceptionally comfortable, and chosen with an undeniable touch of Catherine's warm, welcoming elegance. I walked slowly through the quiet rooms, running my hand along the polished back of a dark leather armchair. Every single detail in this grand house had been meticulously planned by my late wife, while she was quietly fading away in a sterile hospital bed. She poured her rapidly fading strength into building this beautiful sanctuary, ensuring I would have a safe, secure place to land when the betrayal finally detonated my life. I carried my duffel bag directly into the sprawling master bedroom. I unzipped the heavy canvas and carefully removed the silver-framed portrait of Catherine. I walked over to the sturdy oak nightstand and set her picture down, angling it perfectly so her bright smile overlooked the entire room. I stood there for a very long time, simply looking at her beautiful, familiar face. The crushing, suffocating grief that had completely paralyzed me 3 weeks ago was completely gone. In its place was a deep, abiding, and powerful gratitude. She had saved my life. She had given me the ultimate weapon to defend my legacy, and I had used it exactly as she intended. I reached back into the duffel bag and pulled out the thick, banded stacks of cash, along with the untouched bottle of my favorite single malt scotch. I carried the whiskey and the money back out into the main living area. I found a hidden wall safe tucked discreetly behind a beautiful landscape painting in the private study. I secured the $400,000 and the property deed inside the heavy steel vault, locking away the financial foundation of my brand-new existence. I walked into the kitchen, found a heavy crystal glass, and broke the wax seal on the bottle of scotch. The rich, smoky aroma filled the air as I poured myself a heavy, generous measure. I carried the heavy glass out the front door and stepped onto the expansive wooden porch. The air was growing much colder as the sun began its final descent behind the towering, snow-capped mountain peaks. The sky was transforming into a brilliant, fiery canvas of deep orange, vibrant purple, and bruised crimson. I walked to the edge of the wooden railing and looked out over the hundreds of acres of untouched, completely isolated land that now belonged entirely to me alone. There were no nosy neighbors, no demanding corporate boards, and absolutely no manipulative family members waiting to bleed me dry. I was 70 years old, and for the very first time in my adult life, I was entirely, profoundly alone. Yet as I stood there, in the chilling mountain breeze, I realized that I had never felt more powerful. I had faced the absolute worst nightmare a devoted father could endure, and I had not broken. I had successfully defended the massive empire I spent 4 decades building with my bare hands. I had honored my wife's final desperate wishes with absolute ruthless precision. And most importantly, I had surgically excised a malignant terminal cancer from my own bloodline. Jason and Victoria were currently locked away in federal holding cells, facing the total destruction of their own arrogant lives. They would spend the next decade paying the ultimate price for mistaking my paternal generosity for pathetic weakness. They tried to bury an apex predator, and they had paid with their freedom. The sun finally dipped below the jagged mountain ridge, casting long, dark shadows across the sprawling valley floor. The vibrant colors in the sky slowly began to fade into the deep, quiet blue of the approaching twilight. I raised my heavy crystal glass toward the fading horizon, lifting the amber liquid high into the freezing mountain air. I offered a silent, solemn toast to Catherine, to her brilliant, protective mind, and to the magnificent, unyielding strength she had purposefully given me from beyond the grave. I brought the cold glass to my lips and took a slow, burning sip of the aged scotch. The warmth spread deep into my chest, chasing away the last lingering shadows of my past life. I stood alone on the edge of the wild frontier, the absolute undisputed master of my own destiny, fully prepared to embrace the peaceful, quiet years that finally lay ahead of me without any interference. I took another slow, deeply satisfying sip of the scotch, letting the complete, uninterrupted silence of the valley wash over me, knowing without a single doubt that I had finally won this brutal war. Sometimes the blood in your veins is just a biological coincidence, not a guarantee of loyalty. I spent 40 years building an empire, mistakenly believing that providing financial security was the same as raising a man with integrity. I was wrong. The hardest lesson I learned is that blind trust within a family is a dangerous liability. True respect is not inherited. It must be earned and maintained. Setting ironclad boundaries and demanding accountability is not an act of cruelty. It is the ultimate act of self-preservation. Never let anyone, especially your own flesh and blood, mistake your generosity for total weakness. If my story opened your eyes, hit that like button and subscribe right now. Do not let my painful lessons go to waste. Drop a comment below telling me where you are watching from and what you would have done in my shoes. See you in the next true life story.